Yeah, welcome everybody to this third bioregional carrying capacities session. My name is Ralf Thurm. I'm the managing director of R3.0, and I'm just going to introduce, um, the session and then move it over to Joe Brewer, who is sort of a co-organizer of this session as we started these sessions together with the Design School for Regenerating Earth. We had two earlier meetings within the Design School for Regenerating Earth that saw a lot of interest. And then together we decided to open this up to the general public. So see that as sort of like a co-organized first public session between R3.0 and the Design School for Regenerating Earth. And I just don't want to hold it up. I'll hand it over to Joe right away, and I can handle more people coming in here because it pings all the time still. Joe,
Thank you,
over to
Ralph.
you.
Thank you, Ralph. And I'll pass it over to Bill to introduce the session, and he'll be facilitating for today. I just wanted to welcome you all and say that I have been good friends with Bill and Ralph and the R3.0 community for a number of years, going back nearly a decade. Not quite as long as they've been around, but close to it. And we have always been closely aligned and good friends. And one of the things that's been emerging for us throughout the last few months is the awareness that we are actively seeking to hold coherence in the larger field in ways that are very much aligned, and that we often do this in a way that's more behind closed doors, just in the opportunities where we can be helpful. But it's brought us into an alignment of deeper collaborating that we see being really needed as we move into the future. And so one of the things that we're embarking upon this year is to collaborate between R3.0 and the Design School in the entire build-up process to the R3.0 conference that'll take place in September, which is focused on bioregional regeneration. And we have a number of parallel activities happening in the Design School. So this series that you're attending today came out of what we call a themed dialogue. And a themed dialogue is when a member of the Design School decides they want to teach something or lead a discussion on something that they're expert in for other members of the school. And as my partner, Penny Heiple, who is here on the call, she could tell you, she gets very, very busy responding to all the requests from all of our wonderful members to host a lot of amazing sessions. And so Bill Bowie came forward and said, I'd like to host a session on bioregional carrying capacity. And we said, hell yes, let's do it. And that's what's really been the seed kernel of this process that we're in right now. And what I wanted to briefly name before passing it over to Bill is that we're also partners with multiple other partners in creating the Earth Regeneration Fund, which is, in a sense, a way of doing collective storytelling and strategies to mobilize financial resources into bioregional regeneration around the world in many different places. And we see the build up to the R3.0 conference and the focus that they will be talking more about of place-based confluences, and our upcoming learning journey, How to Organize Your Bioregion, which will encourage members of the Design School to create design immersions. These are just two different fancy ways of saying, get people to start practicing organizing locally and figuring out what their bioregion is, and creating clarity with other members of their community to do place-based organizing, while working with those who are more advanced in those processes. And so we see ourselves collaborating around mobilizing funding, helping a much larger diversity of places to engage in this kind of work, and to collaborate across multiple networks, not only R3.0 and the Design School. So there would be the bioregional weaving labs, there would be a BioFi project, there are others, there are actually multiple others that we're forming alliances around for this kind of coherence work. So what you're experiencing today, I would say, is a pillar of that, because we can't actually do bioregional regeneration without some kind of a rigorous understanding of bioregional carrying capacity. And that this ecological understanding needs to be a foundational component of these discussions. So I'm really excited that we're co-hosting this and that we're embarking on this new stage of our friendship and our professional lives. And I will now pass it over to Bill for the rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. And I do think one correction here, I think it's been longer than a decade that we've been playing in the sandbox together. around there certainly. And I just want to, before jumping into this particular session, I do want to give a little bit of background context, just one nod to the design school, that is a member-only space. And so I would want to encourage anybody who's on this call who isn't a member of the design school to consider joining the design school. So that's the container, and Joe and Penny, I think, generously agreed to sort of open this up to the public because we felt like it was a broader conversation. The conversation with R3.0 around bioregional carrying capacity really goes back a long ways. We've had presentations at our conference. I'm thinking about 2018, when James Quilligan presented on the bioregional carrying capacity of water in the San Francisco Bay area. But more formally, this thread emerged late last year in conversation with the Global Commons Alliance, and in particular their Accountability Accelerator, in response to a couple of academic papers, scientific papers that came out of the Earth Commission, which is a component of the Global Commons Alliance, that identified bioregional carrying capacity, or thresholds, or what they call Earth system boundaries, that the bioregional scale is a fruitful scale that should be explored, and it identified some of the challenges around that. So we're in ongoing conversation with the Global Commons Alliance, who I believe is represented here on the call today, while also engaging with other practitioners, both in the bioregional space, municipality space, as our last dialogue goes on, and now bringing us to this dialogue with two prominent scientists in this space. Avit Bhowmik, who serves on the R3.0 steering board. He's spoken in two of our conferences, and he is I say prominent scientist in this space because he has been either a lead author or a co-author on some important papers, including the Powers of 10 paper that he'll tell you more about today, as well as the Global Tipping Points report and others. Also joining us is a longtime friend and deeply respected scientist, Anders Bjørn, who came onto our radar screen with his 2017 study on the existence of ecological limits or planetary boundaries, if you will, in sustainability reporting. And then Anders has also been very active in producing very rigorous research around the Science-Based Targets Initiative, also around taking what's called an absolute approach to life cycle assessment. And so it's that absolute assessment approach that you'll be hearing about today. So this is sort of our next step, looking at some of the scientific perspectives on bioregionalism and bioregional carrying capacity. And so we'll start with Avit in particular, because of that Powers of 10 paper is where we got part of the title, the idea of the sweet spot, if you will. And so Avit will put some real rigorous grounding to the idea of the bioregion as a sweet spot scale of intervention. So Avit, over to you.
Thanks, Bill. It's an absolute honor how you introduced me. And it definitely has been rewarding for me to interact with the R3.0 communities. And since 2023, when you invited me to speak in the R3.0 conference in Amsterdam. And then I have engaged with you in several capacities with several of the projects, and then got in touch with Joe here and interacted there. So we had some really rewarding and intriguing time, I have to say. And to be honest, I am fairly a newbie in the bioregionalism and this bioregional community, to be honest. And I got introduced to this concept or confronted through to this concept actually a year ago, year before I interacted with you for the R3.0 conference. I'm still not quite sure if I see the full picture, because it's such a how shall I put it? Such a rich concept and so much potentials around it. I don't think I have managed to fully unfold it, the whole thought. So that's part of the exercise that I'm gonna do with you today. So kind of my philosophical journey, as you see in the title. So how actually, as we are talking about carrying capacities, instead of seeing it as a constraint, how can we see it rather as an opportunity? And that's something I have been thinking about. I also shared with the R3.0 community some kind of, as we have this framing of planetary boundaries, Johan Rockström and colleagues have pointed out, how could you shift that narrative to something, what I call planetary opportunities? And what's critical to that, I believe, is the term innovation, or social innovation, not in the sense of technical innovation, which is also true and quite relevant. But I'm more thinking about how can we kind of tweak that and tailor that into triggering social innovation. And I see the potential of bioregionalism there as well. So that's something I wanted to do with you today, and hear your thoughts around that, and see the potentials of that. So I would like to start with the carrying capacity. So you are well aware of the planetary boundaries framework by Johan Rockström, and Bill presented, and you are well aware of General Meadows, the limits to growth framework and others. But in my mind, I particularly respect this to, well, not necessarily scientists, but became scientists after all. Which I think the concept of carrying capacity actually goes back days in the around 1940s, when William Vought first coined this term in his book Road to Survival, published in 1948, which became the Bible for the United Nations, United States Environmental Protection Agency. But despite that, I particularly value and respect the paradigm these two people set, which I think is quite at the cornerstone in guiding our society. Also kind of underpinning how we see how we see and kind of found the problems that we are dealing with today in the society. So William Vought, originally a drama critic and a bird watcher, and one of the persons who observed El Nino phenomena very closely around 1941 in one of the Peruvian islands, birds communities dying out, and eventually became a key figure, as I said, in particularly around 1940s in the US. So quite building in the prophecy, and the paradigm, founding this paradigm that the source of the problem that our societies face today is the disrespect to the natural constraints and natural limits, or what he called the environmental carrying capacity. So we are not respectful, not mindful of the finite resources that we have available to all of us. Whereas Norman Borlaug is quite the opposite, and in his book Chelsea Man, the Wizard and the Prophet, named him rather as the wizard, while William Vought holding the prophecy. And these two people actually once met up in a conference of the UNEP, and then since then they have been criticizing each other. Although I don't actually see much of a controversies between their paradigms. But anyway, Norman Borlaug's paradigm is not the resource constraint that drives the society's problem today. Is the lack of innovation. It's the lack of human know-how, how to deal with this problem. And the basis of his paradigm is basically, he was a key person, I think probably a more prominent person than William Vought, Also around 1940s, he saved Mexico from a massive famine that Mexico was about to delve into. And he invented a variety of corn that yielded 4 times the harvest than the traditional varieties. Also at the same time was resistant to one of the fungal disease that was going around, which was actually making Mexico prone to the disease. Anyway, I don't see them as kind of countering each other, these two paradigms, but I see those paradigms rather merging and helping out with each other. And that's what kind of I take as the cornerstone into my dealing with this issue. So how to transfer the idea of constraining planetary boundaries into planetary opportunities. And so that's the book, 1948, William Vogt, and you all know about carrying capacity. That term was coined. But when it comes to like sensing that, I think one of the key reasons why this bioregionalism has been identified as such a key figure and a key term into navigating into the Anthropocene is because it helps us to see the connections, the networks that we have in these social ecological systems, not only the connections among us, the societal connections, how we are connected to each other and part of this big family, but also our connection to nature, our connection to planet Earth. And I didn't sense that while I was doing this study for the Powers of 10 paper, but then I realized when basically what I eventually did in this paper is basically reimagine these connections, this tree of life. So what we did in this modeling, if it's just to reflect on and kind of putting it into the perspective of the bioregionalism, is that we identified how this 10 billion people that will inhabit this planet by the end of 2050 are connected to each other and are grouped. How we can actually utilize these tremendous human resources into action, into either cascading or disseminating the actions, the huge resources that we have to tackle all the problems that we have today. And so that's basically led to this powers of 10 simple exponential categories or social cohorts, starting from individuals to to urban and cities, communities, and eventually to this 10 billion people, which is the P10 core, the 10 billion people inhabiting this planet. And then basically we asked this question. The reason for doing this study was actually this question of, is there a sweet spot for climate actions where we could intervene with the minimum effort but can get the maximum out of it? And obviously we looked at a list of climate solutions then outlined by Project Drawdown. And what we found, actually, there is indeed a sweet spot, which is communities comprising 10,000 people. And at this scale, we could actually implement most of the climate solutions. So 80% of the climate solutions could be operationalized at this scale, and also can deliver the highest economic benefit. The implications of this study wasn't really apparent to me when I published back in 2020. But as it turns out, actually, since it's been published, I got contacted by a diverse range of communities around the world. And one of them is the bioregions. And that's how actually I got introduced to bioregionalism and bioregions. And I take you back to that story directly. But before that, so two things are quite central here. So I also work on what I call the social tipping point, and I had a few sessions with many of you were there. See, if we are to create the enabling conditions for societies to tip, so abruptly changing their mode of behavior, so two points are critical, two factors are critical here, in my mind, at least. The first is the agency, and that's what basically what this Powers of 10 paper is about. Where do we have the agency? it's not the discussion on power and resources, but where do we have the agency, the capacity for decision making, operationalizing, and taking responsibilities? And the answer is there, the powers of the community scale, comprising 10,000 people. But there is one more thing which I think even more critical is the social innovation. Because the discourses that we have in the climate action and sustainability action so far has been dominated by the tech-savvy narratives. And the reasons behind that, we seem to, not we seem to, is kind of got very embedded in the narrative of the human development since the onset of the Anthropocene. Is the technological solutions or technological innovation that has actually driven the prosperity so far, as we see that we live in a world that is healthier and wealthier than ever before. And that has been actually shaped by this development of the technology and the tech sector. And we are kind of trapped into that. Even now, as you see, when it comes to, climate solutions and sustainability solutions whatsoever, the discourses are still kind of trapped around, electric vehicles and solar and wind, which disregards and even makes this whole paradigm a bit problematic, as I see, because we disregard these huge resources that we have within the societies, this local knowledge, dealing with the local resources that are locally available, this indigenous knowledge, how to manage the land and others. And that's actually quite critical. And we see that why these so-called tech-savvy climate solutions are failing and not being incorporated, and not so citizens are not participating. It's particularly because of that, because of disregarding this social innovation. And that's what takes me to that. And this is how I got introduced to the bioregioning. So this is along the River Tay in Dundee in Scotland. So right after I published the Powers of 10 paper, they contacted me during the COP26 to talk about the paper. And the reason was that they were actually quite frustrated because they wanted to start this bioregioning, and they asked the local government, they wanted to reshape the food production system through bioregioning, but there was no resources available for them. And local government didn't, the Scottish government, the local government there, were not really willing, collaborating and helping them. And then I came out with this, Powers of 10, the community level sweet spot, and they got really inspired. They said, what have we been waiting for? We can do it ourselves. And actually they did it. And what they did just within the course of 2 years, they transformed the food production in entire Scotland, I would say. To that extent, now actually Scottish government is willing to adopt this model. So what they did, what I would call a tremendous social innovation, they connected the school classes with the local farmers. And that was like a win-win deal, a 50-50 deal. So basically the food in the school that is cooked, they are delivered by the local farmers who are locally grown. And in turn, the school kids get to help the farmers in farming in their fields. And benefits are manifold here. So particularly during this time, Scotland and the whole world in Europe, went through inflation, where the prices were skyrocketing in the shelves in the supermarket, and where they managed to keep it like really local, and at the same time demonstrate what actually a diverse variety of food you can produce locally and be self-sustained with the delivery of the local farmers. And you can also protect the interests of the local farmers in this age of massive monoculture and industrialization of agricultural system. So that's the model that came out of this bioregioning in this area, and also lead to this social innovation. And I think this is quite fundamental when we talk about, transformation, sustainability transformation, because when we talk about this tree of life and connection to planet Earth, I think in many parts of the world, we are facing these challenges. We almost lost many local varieties that used to grow in these areas. And I think bioregionalism is an opportunity for revisiting them and regaining them, reviving them and bring it back to the context, and underpinning the social innovation around them. Some example here, I don't know how long the time has gone, but yeah, I will try to wrap up soon. But just kind of giving some examples of the social innovation. Something that we have here is called the reoccurring in the place where I live, around Lake Vänern in Sweden. So again, so that's not that's the bioregionalism without actually realizing that that's bioregionalism. So what they did, this network, so this just some local, people who got concerned about like self-sustaining the food production in this crisis as they're going through. So they just build up a network of like whatever they can grow in their backyard. So they just meet once a month in a parking spot in the city center and just sell them whatever. And that was an experience that I have to say that I never thought that I would revisit again, as I grew up in Bangladesh and get to experience that firsthand. But while I ended up in Europe, and experience this massive industrialization of agriculture and others. But the key innovation factor here is that you get to meet the food producers. We live in a world where fish are kind of sold as filet in the supermarket, packed. You don't even get to know how the fish looks like. And the vegetables, they are packed and produced, perfectly shaped, sold. And when you get to buy those food from these producers, you actually smell the soil. And you can ask them their stories, their experiences, how it felt like when they sowed the seeds, when they grow. And it's quite fundamental in shaping the whole narrative about the food production in around. And importantly, what happened in the Tayside case, actually, what can grow, how many colors carrots can have. It's not only the orange carrots that you can have. And that's quite fundamental when it comes to that. I think I'm pretty sure that I'm exceeding the time that I have. But the final examples that from Bangladesh again is part of the UNESCO World Heritage. And Bangladesh is the world's largest delta, and flooding is quite common. So if you ask, a Dutch guy who mastered water engineering around the world, Ralph is sitting here. So their solution would be putting dams and embankments, and we hired many consultants in there. But whereas these people, local communities did, or this bioregion did, they made this, an invasive species that covers the water bodies, water hyacinth, and actually they don't need any nutrients whatsoever. But in terms, it's quite like algal bloom, actually. The chemical prevents sunlight from going in and destroys the ecosystem. So pretty much it's a waste. But they turn this waste into resources. And the key feature of this particular waste that they float on the water. And when you pick them up, when you remove, you have to do it anyway because you need to let the light in. And when you dry them, actually, you can create beds for growing vegetables and flowers and anything that float on the water. And they did exactly that. And not only that, you are also creating a multifaceted ecosystem here. There's the aquatic ecosystems and the terrestrial ecosystems that are interacting. At the same time, demonstrating a tremendous climate resilience around this area. So that's flood resilience, that's ensuring food security. And in my mind, that's the best social innovation ever. So this is, again, so just contrasting with this embankments, these tech-savvy engineering solutions to social solutions that is possible within this sweet spot, within this bioregions that is grounding for. So you are basically delivering or staying within the carrying capacity at whatever scale, if you like, through social innovation, through bioregionalism. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I would stop here and throw this discussion with you. Would like to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Avit. And I think the preliminary answer would be yes, but we will dive much deeper into that question. So thank you for that presentation. I apologize for, I forgot to announce early on to please add your questions into the sidebar. And for people who have comments or resources, generally speaking, there's a rich diversity of resources that people know of, a sort of knowledge base, if you will. And so we created a Google document to harvest those. So I put the link there. So if you do have resources, links, etc., or comments that you want to share, please paste those into the Google Doc. That will be a living repository from this call. Questions, though, in the sidebar is really great. Okay, so now that we've gotten the sweet spot side of things, we're shifting over to the absolute assessment side of things and handing it over to Anders Bjørn to share some of the research and development that he's been doing around methodologies for actually assessing and calculating carrying capacity. So over to you, Anders.
Thank you, Bill. You hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
See the picture shared in full screen and so on?
It is looking great.
Wonderful. So thanks a lot for inviting me, first of all, to this webinar or whatever you want to call it. So I have a title that's quite terrible, but it's because it's the same title as the working title of this paper we're working on. So it's Beyond Net Zero Climate Targets, a vision for comprehensive, consistent, justice, attentive, and granular absolute environmental sustainability assessment. So a lot of blah, blah words there, but hopefully at the end of the presentation, you'll make a little bit more sense of it. So as Bill mentioned, my name is Anders Bjørn. I'm in Denmark, I'm Danish. I have a background in environmental engineering. Since my PhD, I've been focusing on the LCA, the life cycle assessment approach to quantifying environmental impacts of products and technologies. And I've also had a particular focus of integrating the LCA framework with different measures of carrying capacities, including planetary boundaries. And now I'm an assistant professor at DTU Sustain, so at the Technical University of Denmark. And what I'll be presenting here is a draft of a scientific paper that is under development with a bunch of colleagues at DTU. So I should not take the full credit for that myself. So as you all know, sustainable development was nearly 40 years ago defined as something that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, nature or the environment is not mentioned anywhere in this definition. So what are the implications for environmental protection? It's somehow implicit that we need to protect the environment to some extent, because otherwise we are somehow preventing future generations from meeting their needs, but how and how much and so on. So a bit later, we had different people trying to answer that question, including Herman Daly, who's an ecological economist, and he was saying something that sounds quite logical and something it's hard to disagree with, that waste outputs must be within natural absorptive capacities, and you should use renewable inputs no faster than they grow. And you should use non-renewable inputs no faster than you're able to innovate in such a way that you shift from needing non-renewable inputs towards renewable. And so that's quite beautiful in its simplicity, but it's also a bit abstract. Since then, there has been different attempts of quantifying this for different environmental areas, different pollutants, different resource uses. And probably the most famous one is the planetary boundaries concept that I know you all are familiar with already. And important to note, as Bill also mentioned earlier, that within the planetary boundaries framework, we don't only have global limits, we also have attempts of setting regional limits, sometimes at the watershed level, sometimes defined for different geographical units. So now I'm going to jump a little bit, because since I come from an LCA perspective, so life cycle assessment, this is all about quantifying the environmental impacts of products and technologies. There was this quite unfortunate habit for several decades of equating better with good. So it used to be that you went into a store and you looked at products and it was written sustainability all over the packaging. And the argument or the justification was that the product had a lower impact than some sort of market average, or a lower impact than the previous edition of the product the year before. So I would say until recently, it was just sort of understood in the sustainability marketing that you could use the word sustainable to describe anything that performed better than anything else. Now, the problem with that, of course, and now we're in this whole decoupling discussion that I'm sure most of you are already familiar with. When you are in an economy that's growing, then even if you improve impacts or you reduce impacts per unit of economic output, you might still have an increase in net impacts, or in absolute impacts, I should say. So you might have relative absolute decoupling, but not absolute. Even if you have absolute decoupling, it might not be happening fast enough to sort of respect the carrying capacities or boundaries, whether this is globally speaking or regionally speaking. So really the interesting thing here is the decoupling that is both absolute and sufficient. And of course, there's also the question about to what extent does this growth serve people, and what are distributional effects and so on. And I'll come back to that a bit later. And I think we can think of many types of technologies and products that belong somewhere in this zone, where there's either relative decoupling or absolute decoupling. This is Arnold Schwarzenegger that announced famously 15 years ago that now his Hummer was running on vegetable oil instead of diesel. And that could sort of look like, okay, now he took care of sustainability right there. But that's a typical example of substituting one technology with another. But you can imagine if all the people on the planet were to run a Hummer fueled by vegetable oil, then I don't know where we would get all that vegetable oil from. Very few examples, but encouragingly, there are some examples of technologies and products that have managed to have both absolute and sufficient decoupling. So today, when we produce fridges, we basically no longer deplete the ozone layer. So this is one of the success stories of technology recently that have actually managed to, even though we produce a lot of fridges globally every year, many more fridges than in the 90s and 80s, we are still, the ozone layer is actually healing. So we do have some success stories. Now I'm going to jump to net zero targets, because that's a little bit my reference in this presentation. So when you compare this figure of different types of decoupling with the framework of net zero targets, well, you can kind of see that it does belong, and a net zero target does belong to what you could call absolute and sufficient decoupling, because it's about reducing CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions to a level that's zero, or even less than zero when you take into account carbon removal. And so the effect of that, according to climate models, will either stabilize or actually make the climate slightly colder over time, depending on if you talk net zero CO2 or net zero all greenhouse gases. So you could say that this is an example of this switch we are seeing from promoting solutions that are all about relative sustainability or incremental improvements towards something that is actually aiming to reach levels of pollutions that you could say are sustainable and living within environmental carrying capacities. but will they bring sustainable development net zero targets? So there's sort of three issues we identified with net zero targets. First has to do with burden shifting. So a lot of the technological solutions that are being pushed and promoted and innovated and so on for solving climate change, for reaching net zero, they have trade-offs, environmental trade-offs. So they lead to sometimes increased pressures on other environmental categories like freshwater use, land use, eutrophication, air pollution, and so on. That's not to say that there are not co-benefits, because when we stop burning fossil fuels, we also get cleaner air and we get less mining and so on. So there are certain co-benefits of getting rid of fossil fuels, but there are certainly also shifts, especially if we want a bioeconomy, if we want to replace fossil fuels by a thing that we grow in the soil, then for sure there are trade-offs. So it's a little bit like, yeah, I tried asking an AI to generate it. I'm not sure how successful I was, but it's a little bit like if you want to squeeze a balloon to make it small enough, then it's going to bulge out somewhere else. That's the kind of the burden shifting dilemma. So that's the one thing when you are focusing only on climate change, that could be an issue. The second thing is that I think generally, broadly speaking, when business leaders and governments talk about net zero, there's insufficient attention to justice. So it's getting a little bit better, I think, with the new science-based targets initiative guideline. They are really better at differentiating between sectors and so on. But still, there has been this kind of very simple language that, well, all actors need to reach net zero by 2050 or earlier, and we're all in this together and so on. But messaging like that kind of ignores differences both in historical responsibilities for causing what is already more than 1 degree of warming, and therefore a very limited carrying capacity for remaining carbon emissions, but also capabilities of reducing. Some actors are financially or technologically or organizationally better equipped at reducing emissions fast than others. And there's also comes back to the question of needs fulfillment. If you are a nation or a region, a city where half of the people still don't have electricity, and you don't have simple infrastructure, and then of course you need to increase energy use and all these things to meet needs, and that should, it's justified that you have a higher focus on that than reducing greenhouse gas emissions, at least in the short term. So in other words, there's also tension between these kind of simple, all in the same boat messaging, and then with actually the Paris Agreement, which is saying that net zero is to be achieved on the basis of equity, context of sustainable development, and efforts to eradicate poverty. And third, we see a gap between what leaders are saying they're doing and what's happening. So according to the Net Zero Tracker, nearly 90% of global emissions are now coming from sources that are under net zero targets. And that is more than 90% of global gross domestic product. And it's also 89% of population. So this is when you consider together the net zero targets of countries, regions, cities, and companies. That sounds good, right? But you also know this side, I'm sure. So 2024 appears, the data are not quite there yet, but it appears to be a global record in fossil greenhouse gas emissions. I think they've never been higher before. And also 2024 was the first year that actually global temperatures exceeded the 1.5 degree most ambitious ceiling of the Paris Agreement. So there's a gap between what our leaders say they are doing, are committing to, and what's happening. And part of that gap could be, of course, we could probably put part of that gap down to greenwashing, that the leaders that are making these pledges, they know they will never meet them. So it could be simply greenwashing, but there could be a complementary driver could be that there's a lack of actually tools and organization and translations through through bureaucracies and organizations down to the level where we actually make differences in our actions. So these are sort of three main limitations, I would say, of net zero targets when you take when you look at the context of sustainability. So what we need is mature absolute environmental sustainability assessments, and I'm underlying the word mature here because we already have examples of absolute environmental sustainability assessments. Bill Bauer before mentioned the Earth Commission, which has published some studies that some of them I've also been a co-author on myself. And some of them are reviewing the literature on absolute environmental sustainability assessments. And they all basically, the assessments all follow this framework when it comes down to the basics, that you, on one hand, you're estimating the environmental impacts, like the historic or current environmental impacts of whatever actor or activity you are studying. Then on the other side, you are trying to take a list of carrying capacities. Depending if you are the method developer or the method user, you either need to develop this list, quantify them, or you simply take it and use it in your tool. And then you need to allocate these carrying capacities to your specific actor or activity. So from the global scale down to your activity or actor, or from the bioregional scale, if it's a watershed and we're talking water resources, for example, you also need to allocate between actors within the watershed. And then it's kind of simple from there on. Then you have, this is the footprint, this is the allowance, and you compare them it could be a ratio, it could be a subtraction, something like that. That's the basic steps that these absolute sustainability assessments tend to follow, but they are not yet what I would call mature assessments. And so also with point of departure in these three net zero limitations that I went through before, what we at BTU are pushing in this paper is 4 different principles for how you basically build mature methods of absolute sustainability assessment. So you need to be comprehensive, you need to be consistent, you need to be justice attentive, and you need to be granular. And I'm going to go through each of these concepts now, at least highlight them. Just a quick note, and this is really more like a footnote, if you will. So I'm talking from the perspective of industrial ecology, you could say. That's my own background, because the life cycle assessment tool is sort of a key outcome of industrial ecology. But absolute environmental sustainability assessment is equally inspired by ecological economics and earth system science. So it's sort of a tripod, if you will. There are these concepts like the ecological footprint, the planetary boundaries framework, together with the life cycle assessment methodology. In combination, they sort of form the key components of absolute environmental sustainability assessment. So that's just a little academic note, if you will. So let's take a closer look at these principles. So comprehensive, well, that one is actually quite simple to verbalize, because it means that it must cover all the environmental problems that are relevant for sustainable development. Consistency is important, because if you don't have that, then you might reach solutions that are not balanced. So in other words, you need to address trade-offs between different options to problems and scenarios. So if one has a high impact on climate, another have a high impact on water use, but a low impact on climate, it's not always easy to address trade-offs if you're not consistent. And so for consistency, you need impact indicators. So that's basically the unit by which you measure an environmental problem. The set of those impact indicators that cover the environmental problems, they must be mutually exclusive, so they should not overlap, and they should also then be collectively exhaustive, so they should cover the full range of environmental problems without overlapping. And then there should be an equal level of precaution across these carrying capacity estimates. And that's not always the case today. I think we see that, at least, if we commit to a global warming of 2 degrees or something like that, which is like the least ambitious goal in the Paris Agreement, or well below 2 degrees, well below. We can always argue what that means, but basically 2 degrees of warming that is basically a much higher risk you're willing to take than if you look at sort of national standards for how much pesticides there can be in drinking water. I don't know about the US, but in Denmark, if your measurement equipment can detect one molecule of pesticide, the Copenhagen at least will not use drinking water from that source. At least that has been a principle until recently. So that's extremely precautionary. That's saying even if you can just detect it, it's off. We will use another resource. But I think for solutions that are sort of balanced and optimal, if you will, you should have the similar approach to risk management across these different carrying capacity estimates. And then you need to be just as attentive. And I mean, we could also just say you need to have a method that is just, that is ensuring justice. But since it's such a let's say subjective term, justice, and it can be interpreted in so many different ways, we thought it was better to say that a bit more modest to aim for methods that are attentive to justice. So that means offering a range of options that cover the perspective of different stakeholders in your method, and also transparently documenting what the implications for justice are of one or other option. And that might sound a little bit abstract. The second one is to when you talk about these allocation principles for how you basically translate a goal or a limit at the global level or bioregional level down to some sort of allowance or burden, reduction burden on individual actors. Well, what is the principle you use behind that? There's a host of different principles that have been applied in the academic literature and that are also applied in schemes like SBTI and SBTN. And I think the point is that your methods need to incorporate multiple principles so that the users can understand how sensitive their results and conclusions are to the choice of principle, given that it's unlikely that we'll ever reach a sort of global consensus on one like correct principle for allocation. Then there's granular as the fourth principle, and I think this is to some extent the most relevant to a network like yours that is about bioregionalism, because this is about having very detailed in our models, in our estimates of environmental footprints, for example, we need quite detailed representations of technologies and products and prioritizing primary data. So moving away from sort of global average values and things like that. And especially also when we talk about other environmental problems and climate change, it's really important that we pay attention to these, let's say, geographical variations. So ideally, the impacts that we calculate and the allocated carrying capacities, they should sort of be this step of calculating, quantifying these things should be done in separate locations and also time steps instead of just doing some sort of global average value, because that's where you can come into trouble by averaging over different watersheds, where in some watersheds there's plenty of water and in others there's a lack of water, and then on average you're fine. We've sort of seen that in existing studies that water use rarely pop out as a big problem in existing AESA studies because they are not sufficiently being taken into account spatial variations in water scarcity, for example. Yes. Now I know I've been speaking for a while. I have one case study left, and then I'll be at my conclusions slide. And that is the example of SBTN. And I still don't understand to this day if the N in SBTN stands for network or nature, or maybe it stands for both, but at least it's science-based targets for other environmental problems than climate change. And they have, I think half a year ago, they published this, the first, let's say, big manual for companies on how they should set these science-based targets for things like freshwater use, land use, emissions to ocean. And then climate is basically just incorporating science-based targets. So if we do a check on these 4 principles of SBTN, I would say yes, they are at least aiming to be comprehensive, covering all environmental problems that are relevant for sustainable development. Maybe you could say that with the potential caveat that I don't see so much focus on mineral resources. So the use of critical minerals and so on. Then for the granularity, and I'm using it's on purpose. I'm using a slightly different order this time. It's also, to their credit, a very granular framework. So this is an example I took from their report where they have soy milk as a product. And then there's one pathway here that's the production of soy, where the company is sourcing its soy, and another pathway for the packaging. And you can see there are sort of different hotspots for land use, water pollution that are then sort of overlaid on a map. And then the idea is that the company should identify these hotspots, both in terms of its own operations facilities in different regions, but also in terms of its supply chain, so where it's sourcing raw materials from, for example. And then in each of these locations, it should set, or in the hotspots, in the locations where it both have high power to influence change, and also where impacts are quite high, exceeding carrying capacities. This is then where they should prioritize first with their targets. So yes, they are also granular. Consistency, I would say not fully. So I would characterize SBTN as a bit of a patchwork of existing reporting and disclosure schemes, which I think is a good strategy in some ways, that instead of trying to build everything from scratch, they put together what already exists and what companies are used to following in their reporting and so on. But a risk is then that there's not necessarily consistency. So for example, the indicators by which environmental impacts are measured might overlap. I think that's the case, for example, with land use and biodiversity. Having those as 2 different categories could lead to sort of double counting some pressures on the environment. And also the fact that the thresholds, as they call them, which we might also call carrying capacities, they are, if you follow their advice, for each location, they should sort of, with local stakeholders, they should kind of negotiate what these threshold values are. And I think that's maybe, I can see from a sort of procedural justice perspective why it's a good idea. But I think it could maybe also lead to or reinforce what we see that's currently the picture that we see, that in poorer regions, the environmental quality is lower. There's more pollution, more resource overuse, and so on than in richer parts. So I think as a company, if you're sourcing from different areas, I'm not sure it's a good idea to have different standards of environmental protection across. But this is, again, I think this is open for discussion, and it's also an emerging framework, and we'll see where it ends. Then I also don't think they are justice attentive. So we take the example of the allocation principle. So currently, if I'm reading the guidance correctly, and there's quite a lot of pages now, but if I'm reading the guidance correctly, it seems that they basically only suggest or encourage companies to use what we call grandfathering. So that basically means that, let's say that you identify as a company that in this watershed, total water use is 50% too high. Then essentially it means that every single actor, including you as one of the users of the watershed, must reduce water use by 50%. So it's kind of a very simple, mathematically elegant approach. It doesn't require a lot of data and so on. But it also doesn't take into account different historical responsibilities in sort of causing or contributing to the existing state of the environment or the existing level of degradation. And it also ignores different capabilities for reducing pressures, because in reality, it may be possible for some actors to quite easily reduce water use, especially if they haven't had that focus so far. So there are a lot of low-hanging fruits to harvest, while others, it might be really tricky with every cubic meter of water to reduce. So in that way, yeah, this was just to say that we could sort of use this this framework, our framework with these 4 principles, to sort of scrutinize or evaluate these different frameworks that we see around absolute sustainability assessment. So, concluding, we see an ongoing movement to go beyond incremental improvements and in sustainability claims and sustainability commitments, and towards an understanding of what is sort of quantitatively required by individual actors to achieve sustainable development, exemplified by science-based targets, net zero targets, science-based targets for nature, and so on, and other sort of variants that take inspiration in planetary boundary framework. And then I would say that some of these important limitations around net zero targets that I identified, they can in fact be addressed by mature methods for absolute sustainability assessment. And I again underlying the word mature here, because existing methods are not necessarily there yet. So my presentation has been very technical. As you can tell, I'm an engineer, but that doesn't mean that's all that there is to say about this topic, because I think there's a lot of important questions that remain around governance. Like, should these methods, for example, be used voluntarily by actors, or should they be required by regulation? Power relations. Should big companies decide the allocation principles for how to translate global limits or regional limits into allowances and reduction requirements at the actor level? That's a little bit of a, how you say, rhetorical questions, if you will. And risks of greenwashing. For example, you could envision, or you could imagine that actors such as government or big companies, they would use AESA, even mature methods of absolute sustainability assessment, to make really bold reduction commitments, but then actually just continue business as usual. And I want to finalize to underline that risk. There's a paper that came out in Nature Climate Change just a couple of weeks ago, and they did a really amazing job of looking through the reporting and media attention and stock market value of some big companies that made carbon reduction targets. This was before SBTi that these targets were made. And so for example, they conclude that for companies that had 2020 as their target year, where they were meant to reach a certain reduction, so after a firm failed its 2020 emission target, we do not observe significant market reaction, changes in media sentiment, or environmental scores and environmental related shareholder proposals. So whereas the companies got a lot of good attention from media and investors and so on when they announced the target, there was very little focus on the fact that many companies never met their targets, or they simply stopped talking about their targets, or they shifted the targets into something quite different than they originally were. So it seems that there is a huge risk of greenwashing here. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. And I'm sorry if I went over time. I probably did. But yeah, looking forward to a discussion now.
Thank you so much, Anders. I think that you can be forgiven given how rich the presentation was and the issues that you brought up. So thank you to both Avit and Anders. Also, thank you to everyone for posing some really great questions in the sidebar. I want to kick it off with just there was an exchange in the sidebar that I think really points to some sort of transcends what can be addressed in a sidebar conversation. And Avit, this is really geared towards you. So Andrew Simpson asked, what the sweet spot is, and you responded that essentially it's sort of the 10 to the fourth, or I added in 10 to the fourth or 10,000 population, so about the scale of a town. And then Stephen Davies added into that, didn't Schumacher indicate the maximum size for cities should be 500,000, otherwise it would exceed the surrounding carrying capacity? So these questions of scale that are embedded in your Powers of 10 report, I wonder if you could just give a little bit more context around the sweet spot and what scale do you see it crossing? So in other words, is it just that top dot that you saw at the pinnacle, or to what degree do you see that scale, it might make sense to sort of expand the scope of inquiry? And so, what is the sweet spot in your mind or from your research?
Yeah, sure. I'm sure you're gonna share the link to the paper, so I'm not gonna show it here again. But if you look at the original figure in the paper, we did indeed delve into the range of scale, what we call a range of population that you have. So from that point of view, the range that Schumacher pointed out, this 500,000 people for cities, had already been blown out. We have megacities over 1 million people, and that's kind of the max range that we have. But we also have cities that are a couple of thousand people. So there's a wide range. So when I say that 10,000 people, so that's what we looked at is what I call the median population. And when we did this scaling for different social cohorts that we that are prevailing today in the world, so we looked at what is the population size of 50% of those cohorts, average population size. And if you look at the communities, so that's basically the population you end up with. And interesting thing is that when we did this scaling, this logarithmic scaling from 10/10 to 10/0, that's how it lined up really well. Like, for example, for cities, that was like 100,000 people. 1 million people. So that's exactly the median population of 50% of the cities around the world. So that's the kind of the population scaling part. So they reach indeed the range, and that's what basically encouraged us into looking into the median population as well, because it's quite obscure when in platforms like, in the policy making and decision making, when we talk about local, regional, national, what exactly that we are talking about. Is it 1 million people? Is it a couple of thousand people? How many people are we talking about? So that's dealt to that. And sweet spot kind of exactly at this question. So where within the scope of the study, there was a question was, where do we have the agency for implementing the majority of the climate solutions that we looked at? And when we say operationalizing an agency, this is not about providing infrastructure and just, it's not a matter of resources, but more about the agency actually operationalizing the solutions. So just to give you a short example, for example, if a city wants to provide bike infrastructure as a solution, climate solution, so it is quite critical that city authorities provide the bike infrastructure, and the rental bikes, all these things, but still the solution is not operationalized if citizens don't use it. So still, so the definition of agency, so the capacity for decision making, capacity for operationalizing, and capacity for taking responsibility came into play. So in terms of sweet spot and agency, we also found several ranges, like which are the actors, where are the scales where it would come the support from, and where are the scales that you're gonna operationalize it. And our focus on this operationalizing part of that. So yeah, and that's basically encompasses the idea of bioregionalism as well, as I recognized later on, because that's exactly what we are doing in the bioregions, that people are actually operationalizing solutions. So identifying the boundaries that are defined by the natural features and activities, projects that are compatible to these natural features within these boundaries that are defined by the natural features.
Thank you. Thank you, Avit. And just noting, Billy Gridley said in the sidebar, isn't the sweet spot different for different values, goods, and services? We ain't building a satellite in my town, but I could grow a potato. And I think that your response spoke not directly to that, but to the sort of the variability of what you were taking into account with the sweet spot. Any further comment on that, or should we go over to Anders for a question?
No, so as I said, so coupling that, as the focus was on rapid action, what I call the social tipping points. So that was one of the, when it came to social sweet spot, that was the questions, where is the scale that we can trigger the maximum benefit, where we can trigger this positive social tipping points. And so we ended up with, the social cohorts or the geographic scale, if you like. But of course, the sweet spot still, if you look at on a temporal scale, so there's a different sweet spot that we are looking into. We are actually quite interested in looking into that, but this is more about the human adaptive capacity, if you like, in the Anthropocene, this idea of adaptive cycles and others, how people actually adapt to the shocks that systems experience. So there, basically, the size where kind of brings people together into action and build up this, communities and social cohorts. That was our focus. But of course, sweet spot still is a very generalized terms and could be applied to or tweaked into the purpose of the research that they're doing.
Right, exactly. So it's key to remember that this was specific to climate solutions, that if we looked more broadly at sort of bioregional regeneration, which is sort of an issue that Carrie Norton brought up, yeah. We might have different definitions of sweet spot. So I think that's a really important distinction there. Great. Anders, let's go over to you for a question. And there's some degree of back and forth already in the sidebar, but I think there's really value to getting some of these questions out on verbalized. So Neil Davidson had a few questions for you. One of them, I think, you've started to answer is, does your paper take into account that due to overshoot and ecological collapse, environmental carrying capacities will likely diminish, potentially catastrophically, not stay as assumed as a straight line? So you started to answer that in the sidebar, but I think that's a question that really warrants a sort of a more fulsome, articulated response.
Yeah, definitely, and thanks for the good question, Neil. So yeah, sorry, some of the figures I presented in the slides were kind of ugly, a bit drafts, and then for the paper we'll publish, we'll make them much better and have a proper graphical artist working them out. But the figure on the decoupling, the carrying capacity line is actually going down a little bit. And it was to indicate that for some impacts, it is likely going down over time. But again, it's very much dependent, like you say, over it depends on what environmental problem you're looking at, and also what happens across the field in terms of impact. So that there are studies showing that if you exceed one planetary boundary by 10%, 50%, then that can shift the position of another planetary boundary, typically down, but in some cases also up. So climate and the freshwater boundaries are very interlinked in that way, because as Earth warms, some areas will be wetter and others will be drier, and the dynamics over time, over seasons also change. So that will obviously impact the amount of carrying capacity you have in terms of how much water use you can take at a given water basin, even at a monthly level, right? So yes, we are aware of that, and so it was what we are trying to present here is a framework. It's not quantifying the values as such, but I think our framework can accommodate this complexity. I saw you also ask about economic growth. Bill, should I address that right away?
That'd be great, Anders.
Yeah. So of course, I was expecting to maybe provoke some of you by having this line going up showing growth. And again, our framework is a bit agnostic when it comes to how much growth, what kind of growth, who is benefited by the growth. It can kind of work, the framework can work in different settings. It can work in a setting where there's growth, can also work in a setting where you have a steady state economy or even degrowth. I think the point is just that, and it's quite important to communicate this to actors, that the more growth you are aiming for, well, the harder you need to reduce your impact per unit over time, right? That is kind of goes without saying, and that's also what a lot of climate scenarios suggest, that if you assume business as usual growth, then we need all these magic technologies like carbon removal and so on in order to, on paper, live up to the temperature ceiling that we see, and we need to allow to overshoot and then cooling again and all these problems. I would say that many regions in developing countries need growth, period. Like need to grow in energy, need to grow in materials for roads and hospitals and other things. And that's not to say that I think they should copy the growth model of more rich regions of the world, but certainly there's a need of certain types of material and energy growth in many parts of the world.
Great, thank you. And Neil, I see your hand, but I wonder, I want to diversify the voices of questions in here. So thank you. So I wanted to ask or voice one question that I'd say is sort of more on a say technical side of things, and then there's a cluster of questions that are really opening up to a more larger picture. So Daniel Ospina asked, particular to Anders, are the vision and principles you presented feasible in voluntary target setting schemes, or do they require a top-down regulatory framework that allows a full accounting of the aggregate pressures that are sustainable? So I don't mean to sort of diminish this question. Obviously, actually, philosophically, it's a huge question, but I think I'd pose that question. Anders, if you could sort of answer that relatively succinctly, and then I want to pose a couple of other bigger questions.
Yeah, so great question, Daniel. And I, as we both know, we have been discussing that many times before, at least sometimes before. So I would say that what I see existing methods for absolute sustainability assessment, they take this Kant approach, the Kant philosopher approach, saying that every actor should act in such a way that if every other actor in the world act the same way, we will have a good outcome globally. So it means that even if it's just a handful of actors that voluntarily commit to reducing by a certain amount, they should not sort of necessarily bear the burden for the fact that a lot of actors are free riding. That's, I think, the philosophy that I think SBTi is also following. But there has been discussions about having certain buffers into the methods. So assuming that there will be laggards, then the ones that are on board must reduce by an even higher amount. But then it gets tricky because then you need to factor that into the equation.
Yeah, thank you, Anders. And that was a relatively succinct response to a question that actually is pretty thorny.
Yeah,
and so I think that sort of points us to some of these bigger questions that have been coming up. I'll just note before moving on that Neil also pointed out that the cumulative impacts of drivers from outside the bioregion, how are they accounted for? And so this, and you did address the question, and in some ways this was one of the instigators, is how does one sort of balance a bioregionally just allocation, if you will, or an application of thresholds that are relevant for the bioregion without sort of outsourcing the problem. So that's one layer of question. I think two other layers that I want to put in here is Carrie Norton said, how do we truly address the notions of the commons in a more sophisticated way, revisiting the very notion of ownership and power? And then Michael Haupt said, and I know I'm putting a few big issues out here, so I'll leave it up to you, Avit and Anders, to sort of pick and choose how to respond to this. Michael Haupt said, I'm hungry for a dialogue that moves beyond the themes we have heard before. In what ways could net zero, planetary boundaries, carrying capacities, and other popular frameworks be inadvertently reinforcing existing power structures, and how do we switch the narrative to prevent this? In other words, what's the evolutionary coherent way forward? So maybe Avit, I'll toss it to you first, and then Anders for your thoughts on this sort of cluster of three questions that you can hone in on one of them, or sort of think holistically about the three of them.
Okay. So the second question first, like, how do we get out of this vicious circle? Well, I think bioregion itself is quite central to that, coming out of that. You know, as I kind of tried to frame but probably failed, this regulatory framework that we have around planetary boundaries. Let's say that's the probably most popular framework that got adopted by several regulatory authorities. But as we still see that it's still challenging when it comes to the downscaling, as they call it, planetary boundaries to an utility scale where you can actually use it, align it. And we still don't see any framework, actually, translation framework, how we could make planetary boundaries such framework useful. Whereas some steps were taken, I'm aware of a research that did that for translating it for the national scale. But I think it's pretty much call it resilience, sustainability, and probably tied to the first question as well. It's so one overarching discussion here we should be having. So is it really resilience that we are aiming after, or is it sustainability? Because in my mind, they're quite different, where resilience incurs, you know, the persistence and transformation to some extent. Sustainability is more of a long-term view. And whatever we are doing, and I think, and we should be quite mindful of that, if you think about the problems that we are facing today, and we are having all these discussions here, that was actually a solution 200 years ago, depending on how you started. But this invent of fossil fuel and James Watson's steam engine was actually seen as the solution to the mobility problems and industrialization problems at that time. But because of not having this sustainability view, you know, to have this now it ended up with the problem that we're dealing with. And we should be quite careful of that. Every solution that we talk about and regulatory framework that they're promoting might take us to that stage, like in another 50 or 100 years from now on. So which might be resilient. So all these solutions that we look at, electric vehicles, you know, solar panels and others, they might be some resilient solutions, but not necessarily sustainable, not in my mind. So this is quite a two different sectors that. So I think that's the way forward, at least in my mind, how we could come out of this vicious cycle and take that forward, that we distinguish between being resilient, being persistent, where it's being sustainability, that's core, and social innovation. Again, that's why I wanted to kind of bring that up to the discussion. I think it's quite central to that as well. Like how we see it, it's not about some texts and some regulatories or some policies coming and solving it, but actually kind of finding the solutions within, and through the connections with the planet Earth that we kind of almost about to forget. I know that this is quite a philosophical answer, probably, but I think it's still quite a paradigm shift that we are looking for here, rather than you know, some technical fixes.
That's great. Thank you very much, Avit. Anders, over to you for all this cluster of the easy questions, so to speak.
Yeah, thank you. But I don't know if I should thank you, actually, because I'm really on deep water here as an engineer, because I'm used to, I see something about a mechanistic worldview and so on in the chat, and this is kind of where I come from with my discipline. But I am sometimes having a gut feeling that some of this, like I had on the last slide of my presentation, that there are risks of greenwashing whenever you come up with tools for simplifying the world and quantifying how much we need to reduce and this and that. But that's why I think we need other expertises, and we need people, engineers like me, to listen to other expertises like Avit and some of you other guys in this room for how to combine different types of knowledge in a good way. And I think I'm especially a bit torn on the question of resilience versus efficiency. So, big companies can be quite efficient with their supply chains in terms of producing this component where there's plenty of water and producing that component where there's a lot of hydropower plants. So there's plenty of green electricity production because that's also cheap and so on. And so oftentimes products that come out of complex supply chains, they are actually on paper quite good for the environment. Like they will have a quite low carbon footprint, but it doesn't tell the full side of the story, or the full story about sustainability, because it also means that the more these solutions are being promoted, the more we sort of reinforce unequal power relations with big companies having a lot of power and influence over government. But then on the other hand, if we move in the complete other extreme, we can imagine bioregions where there's absolutely no contact. They are hermetically sealed off from the rest of the world. They just have to manage with the resources they have and nothing else. That also doesn't seem like, the best option, because then there are definitely human needs that cannot be met, or that just cannot be humans living in certain bioregions, right? Because of lack of certain types of resources. So there's some sort of balance that has to be made between local and resilient and simplicity and then these insanely complex global supply chains we have today. So that's my extremely vague answer to that whole suite of questions.
Well, and that in some ways brings us full circle, Anders, because it was really that's one of the questions that's posed in the Earth Commission papers that I referenced at the outset, one of which you were a co-author on, that sort of identified this sort of dynamic balance or tension between bioregional carrying capacity and global carrying capacity, and in particular, what they call a global citizen perspective, where we're not we're neither sort of prioritizing bioregional carrying capacities at the expense of other places in the world, nor vice versa. And I think that that's a very complex balance that will be likely the most challenging part of this research project around bioregional carrying capacity. I do want to acknowledge that we're a little bit over time, and so in particular to our speakers, I recognize that you may need to jump off, and so totally fine if you do need to do so, or if others need to jump off. We typically do keep the line open a little bit longer for those who can stay on, but I just want people to make sure that there's no offense taken if you do need to drop off. I do know that Sanjay had a specific question or point that he wanted to voice, but I'll just at this moment I'll at least thank Avit and Anders for your time in case either of you do need to drop off. Thank you very much for agreeing to participate both in this session and in the ongoing research project, to the degree that we move these conversations trigger movement forward on that. So thanks to you for that.
Thanks, Bill. Just to let you know, I'm happy to stay on another 5-10 minutes. I'm part of the reason we are late. I'm well aware of that.
Well,
Great, thanks.
I share the equal slice of the pie, Anders. So yeah, but I'm also happy to stay around and actually hear some of the perspective from the audience. I mean, we didn't manage
Right.
to hear
Yeah.
much.
Yeah.
What do you
Great. Sanjay, over to you, please.
I'm just gonna refill my water glass and I'll be back.
Okay, thanks. It's interesting. Anders mentions about greenwashing. I was at New York Climate Week last year, and they said for regenerative ag specifically, there are 130 plus definitions. So everybody is like kind of confused. So there's potentiality for greenwashing happening, say, in the context of regen ag. So I want to touch on that point, but I want to also touch on what Avit talked about, sustainability and resilience. And I wanted to share this resource. Basically, you folks may already know it. This book, and it talks about habitability, going beyond sustainability and resilience, and thinking in the context of biodiversity. It talks of planetary subsidiarity, how we think in terms of the planet, and then come all the way to bioregions. So my question is really, since it talks of planetary subsidiarity, which is multi-level governance, and the current governance system is, frankly speaking, broken, right? We talk global, but we have to think planetary instead. And then we talked about the bioregional carrying capacity, and Avit also hit about social innovation. So I'm curious about practical governance models, how that will be, how you folks envision that happening, just trying to get different perspectives on it, especially because if you think about, there's so many frameworks. There's a framework on circularity. We already have mechanisms in terms of where SBTI might be dead, but then there's SBTN and other ways to look at it. So I'm curious in terms of bioregional carrying capacity, planetary subsidiarity, and a completely paradigm shift that some folks talked about. How do you folks envision potentially getting to this new future state, which is different from our current, which fundamentally is broken, as we all know? And I'm going to put some of these resources into the document as well.
Thank you, Sanjay. Anders, you're off mute, so I'll put you in the hot seat to begin with, if you're open to that.
Yes. You mean to react to what Sanjay was saying, or?
Yeah, in particular, I mean, this may go outside of your specific area expertise, but really the question around governance, what kind of governance models can be applied, and again, I don't know if that fits within. It's in some ways related to the, is this a voluntary or a mandatory approach? But just your thoughts would be great.
Yeah, I will just give ultra short thoughts because I think others on the call can probably say something more intelligent. But I think what I see in the context of science-based targets, for example, and science-based targets for nature that I've been engaging with, is that we have up until this point, it's mainly been voluntary for actors to use these absolute assessments or to set science-based targets for future reductions based on absolute assessments. But there are some signs, for example, in Europe with the corporate responsibility directive, the CSRD, that are now requiring companies above a certain size to report on sustainability and climate and all sorts of dimensions in a much more rigorous way than what has happened until now. And they are not. CSRD is not requiring companies to set science-based targets, at least not yet, but they are requiring companies to document how climate targets were calculated and if it was based on a certain method and so on. So I think we are seeing signs that these things are perhaps moving from voluntary to mandatory regulated space in terms of reporting. And if we just look at how companies are reporting on financial performance today, that also used to be much less regulated. Like if you go back centuries, but over a lot of time, there's been very, very rigorous requirements and huge implications if a company is reporting the wrong financial numbers, right? It can basically lead to huge fines and fraud investigations and so on. And yeah, we're just seeing some signs that these assessments are moving into becoming into regulatory space. Whether that's always a good thing, that's another question. But I think that's as much as I can comment on that for now.
Thank you, Anders, and with sort of an acknowledgement that bringing CSRD into the mix here opens up a bit of a can of worms that's probably bigger than we can handle. I think if Ralph were to start answering that, it would take quite a while.
Couple of hours.
Yeah. So Avit, over to you on questions of governance, and then I have another prompt in queue.
Yeah, no, I think Sanjay himself said it all. So to be very brief on that, so we just need polycentric governance with good enough flexibility in it. So if you look at at the core of the problem, the range of globalization that we see, what we did basically, we tried to make the governance system that is very rigid and homogeneous, and which is not working out, because that's exactly when this suppression on the indigenous communities and their governance system, and that forgetting the bioregional boundaries and kind of again suppressing them with these administrative boundaries. You know the story of Africa, right? The African countries, how they're dealt with, and that's exactly what happens. So yeah, but I think we started seeing the values of it during the pandemics. We saw that the resilience around the world and the adaptation to that, actually those who had this polycentric flexible governance system actually were the most successful ones that dealt with the crisis. And we had this discussion with Jem Bendel, right? So exactly, so you see, so when you have a meltdown, so that's basically a governance system you get accounted to. So basically you identify a group of people who shares the same value, and what to protect there, and how to protect there. So you figure it out. So this is, I think it is all about diversity or all about complexity. So we need to be more diverse and less organized, if that makes any sense.
It does make sense of it, and we talk a lot about pluriversal approaches here at R3.0, drawing on the work of Arturo Escobar and Ashish Kotari. So thank you to the both of you. We do need to round things out, and I wanted to give Joe Brewer as a co-host and an opportunity to just chime in on this question in particular around governance, in particular from a bioregional perspective. So Joe, we'll hand it over to you for some final thoughts before we end up here.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Thank you, Avit and Anders, and thank you everyone for a lovely discussion. I'll be brief because we are over time, but I just want to focus on the word governing from the lens of an ecological worldview, where the universe is alive and filled with sentience, or as indigenous people might say, is filled with the Great Spirit. And then to see what governance means from that lens, and then how a bioregional point of view just pops out naturally as a holistic scale, not the only, but one of the holistic scales. And this is related to what I said in the chat about having an ecological worldview rather than a mechanistic worldview, is that if we're able to understand how emergence works as a kind of innate intelligence in the creativity of the universe, that's a nice scientific way of coming in. But I was in a meeting about 2 weeks ago where there was an indigenous woman who's on the International Joint Council for the Great Lakes as a scientist, but she's also an indigenous leader. And she talked about She's from the Haudenosaunee Federation. And what she said that really struck me was she used the word responsibility as it relates to water in a way I think we all could learn from. She said the water has a responsibility, and our job as humans is to not get in the way of the water's responsibility. Water is the sacred feminine. The water's responsibility is to bring life. And humans are not allowed to violate the sacred responsibility of water to do what she does. And by the way, water is female, because water is the feminine energy of creativity in the universe. If there's no water, there's no life. And so to see how governing through the lens of the sentient intelligence of a living universe would say, well, a river has the responsibility to do what a river does, which is to create the conditions of regeneration in terms of the movement of nutrients and the cycling of water in hydrological patterns and the feeding of root systems and everything else that a river does. And when we think in this way, what we end up with is an awareness that the entire planet is self-organizing around the sacred responsibility of water, and that it self-organizes into functional landscape systems and extended eco-regional geographies, and that humans are a part of this and need to find harmony within it. And so you can see it gives us a very different way of understanding governing. But we end up with just what Sanjay said about polycentric governance. We end up there again, but we end up there by recognizing that the way to do something like restore a watershed is to watch the water, to learn the intelligence and the language of water, and then to work with water to restore life to the land by letting the water do its job, letting the water has her own responsibilities. And so how this relates to bioregionalism in a really clear way is that bioregionalism is the coherent identity of cultural and ecological realities. They're cultural and ecological realities because of their coherent autopoietic patterns, their regenerative patterns. And so if you looked at something like the salmon and the longhouses of the people of the Pacific Northwest in North America, it's not an accident that they conform very closely to what is called Cascadia today, which is the self-organizing identity of a bioregional movement, because those patterns are self-organizing. And so here we see organizing and self-organizing and emergence and complexity, those concepts from science, those beautiful concepts from science, are attuned to the intelligence of the universe as the patterns of creativity of complex adaptive systems. So I wanted to say this to say that part of the way that we identify bioregional carrying capacities is we do what Anders showed us. We do what Avit showed us, which is we actually analyze the patterns and their relationships and their quantities. Thank you to the engineers. And we do what Avit showed us, which is there are self-organizing scales that can create tipping point dynamics. And we need to look at those self-organizing patterns and their characteristic scales. So thank you both for that kind of work. And then the third, the component that's missing from the scientific analysis, and there's nothing wrong with it, it's just incomplete, is that indigenous people would then come in and say, but there are protocols to be in right relationship with the rest of life, the non-human kin, which would include rivers and mountains and not only what biology calls life, because they don't have those boundaries, or rock is not alive. Rocks are mostly fossils and minerals from previous life cycled through plate tectonics for billions of years. And so what it gives us is a recognition that we actually need a two-eyed way of seeing. We need to look at bioregional carrying capacity through the indigenous wisdom traditions of indigenous worldviews and the best of our systemically oriented science, which is our complexity and ecological sciences. Complexity, ecological, and evolutionary, as David Sloan Wilson would say, what he would call type 2 dynamic systems. Type 2 dynamic systems are evolutionary adaptive systems. So it's like living systems are a subset of complex adaptive systems, and they're evolutionary. Complex adaptive systems don't need to be evolutionary because there's a broader category. So like the solar system may not be an evolutionary by a Darwinian sense, but certainly an ecosystem is. And so just to recognize that Where those two come together is where we're going to find governance. We're going to discover it. But we'll discover it in partnership with water, in partnership with microorganisms and soils. By the way, this is what permaculture teaches us, is the ethic of observation and partnership, participating in the living patterns of a place. And the governance emerges between the living world and the human part of the living world, which is smaller. And so, so I just want to name that and say that these conversations are really important because there are key ideas. And I'll just give one example that Anders gave us, which is with that balloon where you squeeze it in one place so it gets bigger in another, is that is the intelligence of an adaptive system. An adaptive system has feedbacks. And so we need to recognize how those feedbacks work and all that we're doing. And this carrying capacity discussion is very important to that. And it's going to scale up to Earth system dynamics, to the scale of, ocean circulation, of jet streams, of various things that move larger than bioregional scale, but that bioregions create compatibility with them as coherent life places over extended periods of time, which is like the boreal forest has been there for tens of thousands of years because it's coherent with the jet streams, as just an example. So that's what I wanted to say. Governance is actually done by the Earth, and humans play our part in participating in the governance, which has various appropriate scales, which is why the sweet spot and tipping point conversation is so helpful to bring it in with clarity and then create new questions. So that's what I wanted to share. And I'm just really excited we're having these conversations because we need to be governing this in a distributed manner among all of us. So thank you so much for giving me a moment to share. And I'm excited to see where this conversation goes.
Thank you, Joe, for those comments. Thanks to you and Penny and the design school, and also members of the design school who helped to incubate this series. Thanks again to Avit and Anders for speaking in this particular session. And thanks to all of you for attending this. Finally, thanks to Ralph as my colleague in R3.0 for all the work that we do together. We will be continuing this series. We don't have nailed down a next session yet, but we're generally doing this on about a monthly basis. We do have our next open dialogue set for the 20th of February, and that will be on bioregioning and permaculture. And including Elias, I think Elias is still here on the line, as well as Gloire and Julie. You can find more information about that on the R3.0 website that we've just revamped to include our bioregioning work. So thanks everyone for attending. We will post the recording and deck on our website and on LinkedIn and social media in the wake of this. Give us a few days to process that. And I look forward to seeing many of you on our next session. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
You go. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks,
Bye.
Bill. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.